The opinions you hear on Your Mountain from individual hosts or guests do not necessarily represent those of Your Mountain, our sponsors, or other entities we're affiliated with professionally or otherwise. You've waited long enough. Go listen to the show.
There are millions of acres of opportunity out there. They belong to you. Every day, decisions are being made that affect your land, your water, your wildlife. You should know about them. This is Your Mountain.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Your Mountain podcast. I'm your host, David Wilms. Nephi Cole, sitting on the other side of my screen. How are you doing, Nephi?
What's up, Dave? How you doing, buddy?
Oh, I'm doing great. You sound good.
Yeah.
You sound good.
That's the idea. That's why we spend all the
We're making changes.
I
at
don't
the
know
Your
why
Mountain
we spend all
podcast.
this money, to tell you the truth. Yeah, making changes.
Making
Video
changes.
on the Your Mountain podcast. Yeah, I mean, it's you know what it is? Too much disposable income. You have too much money.
We're trying to keep up with the Joneses, right? Everybody's doing it. We feel like we ought to. If you're listening on audio, keep doing it as usual. But if you've ever wonder what those guys look like that run this podcast. Well, now you can find out. You can go over to YouTube, to our YouTube channel, and watch us there. You can watch the podcast. Now we've decided to do actual video. So here we are in all of our glory, Nephi.
Yeah, and the funny thing is we have no idea what this is going to look like either, because the program that we use, just so everybody knows, it's a phenomenal program. We'll give them an endorsement right after they give us an endorsement. But the program that we're using, there's like an AI agent. So we're on the AI bandwagon. AI is working for us, switching back and forth between different camera angles and things like that, because we ain't got time for that. We ain't got time to figure it out. I mean, I'm sure somebody could pay somebody to do it, but instead we paid a bot.
Here's what I'm hoping. I'm hoping that this makes it a little bit easier for us, which means we might get more consistent and record more often because we're not stressing out about, on your end, the editing and so forth, and on my end, all the production side, the getting it, pushed out there. So maybe, just maybe, we'll make some more content a little faster with this new technology we're using.
It's an interesting theory. So yeah, we'll be trying some different mics and some stuff like that to try and make sure the sound sounds good for everybody. But yeah, it's a new world. So there we go.
I've always said that you and I have a face for radio and a voice for silent film, and yet here we are trying to do both of them at once, both audio and video.
It'll be fine.
We could see our numbers tank, but we'll give it a try.
Yeah, I'm sure because people have been listening, because that's why they've been listening before.
Hey, so we got a whole bunch of stuff.
If there's anybody still here, you said we could tank, but if there's anybody still listening to the podcast after like 2 months of not releasing one, we should just start over. We should change the name. It should be a new podcast.
No. We can't change everything all at once, because the next thing that's going to change is our email, because we're not going to use that email account much longer. In fact, maybe by the time this is published, we may have made that change too. So we'll get that information out. Look in when we do set up a new email address. If you want to get a hold of us, I'll put it in our show notes. So check it out there, or episode description. I guess we don't ever really do show notes, but maybe we will, because I think this new AI helps us with that. But go check it out there when we get it. If you want to get a hold of us, I'll put it in our new episodes going forward, what our new email address is. And until then, you can still find us on social media at the handles at It's Your Mountain on Instagram and on Facebook. And we are now probably going to have to look at YouTube a little more frequently than we do, but I don't think there's direct messaging on that platform. So just DM us on Instagram or Facebook, and then we'll get you our new email contact here soon. Now that business is out of the way, let's talk about what's going on in the world right now. There's we got sort of I'd call them a plethora of stories from different parts of mostly the West. But different states in the West that we want to start off. And I think it's fun to start with a good news story. I think this is a pretty cool story out of Oregon. Do you want me to tee it up, or do you want to tee it up?
You can. I mean, Oregon, to be frank, there hasn't been a lot of great news coming out of Oregon with the ballot measure proposal to ban hunting, but this is actually going the opposite direction. So,
yeah,
thanks,
so
Oregon.
Yeah, this is I think it was the last episode or two ago where we're kind of bad mouthing. Was that Oregon or Washington? Now I can't even remember. We weren't bad mouthing Oregon yet.
It was Washington.
It was Washington we were bad mouthing, not Oregon. But anyway, Oregon in the past few days, and we're recording this here on March 7th, just as a timestamp. But a few days ago, the Oregon legislature passed House Bill 4134, otherwise known as the 1.25% for Wildlife Act. And as a little background for this, states across the country, wildlife agencies across the country are in a constant battle for figuring out how do we fund wildlife conservation, wildlife management in the state. We'll talk more about all of that here in just a second after we talk about this bill a little bit. But Oregon's no different than a lot of other states. It's where are we going to get the resources to fund wildlife management that historically is coming from hunters and anglers, but now there are so many strains and demands on the wildlife resource, and so many expectations of the public on the things that should be done for managing the resource, that it's simply the agencies are strained. And there have been efforts at the federal level for a number of years to pass legislation that would help provide additional stream of revenue to states to help with implementing what are called these state wildlife action plans, which are really meant to fund wildlife management for what you would mostly think of as your non-game species, and species of special concern or species of special need. And that legislation that's been called Recovering America's Wildlife Act for a number of years, it keeps hitting roadblock after roadblock after roadblock. And in the meantime, states' budget gaps continue to grow. Inflation continues to grow. The strains on the resource continue, and they're looking for funding. So enter this proposal in Oregon, and it took place over the course of, I want to say, about a decade, where all these coalitions formed to push for new funding streams, and it led to this bill. And this 1.25% is a 1.25% tax on lodging tax, increase in the lodging tax in Oregon. And that 1.25% lodging tax is going to generate roughly $38 million a year for wildlife management, fish management, habitat conservation. It's still, as of the time we're recording this, I don't know if it's been signed into law by the governor yet, but that's where it is. As we're recording, it's on the governor's desk. So it's a big deal. That's a lot of money, a big shot in the arm, and a pretty steady stream of revenue. And it's going to be good for wildlife in the state. And I'd argue it's going to be good for hunters and anglers too. But
that's interesting. I think it's worth pointing out the devil's advocacy side of that, which is the reason that some of these things have issues and why there are sportsmen's groups who are scared of them, right? And I can't say that I'm scared of it, but I say that I recognize the concern, which is when in the past. So we look at where the money comes from game and fish agencies, right? And we've gone, and I say nationally it's roughly a 50-50 split. It's not quite, but when you look at where money for game and fish agencies comes from, it's primarily from sportsmen, so sportsmen's dollars, from the purchasing of tags, so tags, licenses. It's payments at the state level made by sportsmen. And then, of course, you have a tax from the firearms and ammunition industry from certain fishing tackle and bows, and that's Pittman Robertson, Deagle Johnson. And so that makes up not quite half, but it's close. And so you have these two big pots of funding that are the primary drivers of wildlife funding in the U.S. So what's the concern? You think, well, let's just say we got Recovering America's Wildlife Act. So if you were to be the guy, the conspiracy theorist, the scared guy, what you'd say is, well, here's the problem, is that before, when you looked at this couple $1 billion a year that are getting spent on wildlife habitat, wildlife issues, who's paying for it? Well, sportsmen are. And so what does that give sportsmen? It gives them the primary seat at the table. So when things are going on, when people are making decisions about, you know, what's important, when you're, for example, in a state that like Colorado, where you're trying to decide who goes on a commission, well, it's pretty easy to say like, well, it should be a sportsman on the commission. Why? Well, that's who's paying for it, right? They're bringing the dollars to the table. Well, what happens when you bring other sources of funding? Well, you're bringing other people to the table, other stakeholders that are also helping pay for wildlife. And so the argument that, I see the argument and I think it's valid is like, okay, well, who else gets a say? If somebody's paying as much money, you can no longer say as a hunter, you're like, well, I'm the one paying for all the wildlife conservation, because they are too. And so that's the concern I think that people have with bringing on other sources of funding, which is kind of funny, right? It's kind of like cutting off your nose to spite your face. It's like, well, I don't want your money for habitat because I want to be the guy that's paying for all the habitat. Well, it's kind of a weird position to be in. But
can I play the devil's advocate to the devil's advocate?
Absolutely.
I don't know what that actually is, but let me ask you a question. Where does California's money come from for their wildlife agency? I mean, you know the answer.
No idea.
I mean, I think you know the answer. Right. Where does Washington State's money come from for their wildlife agency?
So let's talk about where different state agencies are getting their money, right?
Yeah, but before we do that, I want to make my point here really quick before we get into that. My point is, as the kind of the counter to your devil's advocate, is that it actually has less to do with who's paying for the who's footing the bill for wildlife management as far as who has a voice. It really has to do with the politics of the state, because hunters and anglers in most of these states, and a couple of the ones that I'm talking about, where there are significant controversies right now around wildlife management because of the makeup of the commission and what they're doing to hunters, for example. Like, it's hunters that are still funding that, but it's the politics of the state that are driving the commission makeup to be different and to put different users on the commission. So
what you're saying is they don't care where the money comes from. If they're, the politics of the state, they don't care if it's sportsman's money. They don't ask you as a sportsman whether or not, what you think. They're going to do it anyway.
That's kind of my point, right? And here's the second piece, the second point I'd make, which is when this model was established 90 plus years ago, roughly 100 years, we'll call it a little over 100 years ago, this user pays model of funding wildlife conservation. The general idea was at the time, right? We're talking about the early 20th century when this started, and then the Pittman-Robertson Act was layered on in 1937 and Dingell-Johnson in 1950, right? There are these layers added, but the original user pays model of go out and buy a license, and that money goes back into the agency or back into wildlife management or so forth, was sort of born out of a time when the wildlife that people cared about were, I know, Murphy, it's interesting.
It's my
but the wildlife
UPS man on a Saturday is probably going to kill us all.
The wildlife that people cared about were wildlife that had been hunted to near extinction, right? And it was trying to figure out, how do we bring those back? Things like mule deer and elk and pronghorn and bighorn sheep and black bear and wild turkey and even whitetail. All of these numbers were deeply suppressed. And so we had this model that was really focused on hunters were the ones consuming the resource. And so the money was going to go back into helping recover that resource. And I would argue that it's changed a little bit since then, right? And we've talked about this before. And I just want to layer this on, this idea of consumptive versus non-consumptive users, and it's been a pet peeve. I don't know if it is for you still. It's been a pet peeve of mine for a while, and I talk about it every chance I get. In fact, I was at a meeting a couple of weeks ago where I was talking with some state agency folks, and we were talking about that, and I said, whoa, let's work on changing this narrative. Let's not be calling hunters consumptive users and everybody else non-consumptive users. The recreation community as a whole, those that are getting out and enjoying the outdoors, that are wanting to see wildlife, they might be camping, biking, hunting, hiking, wildlife photography, you name it. They're having an impact in some way. They're a consumptive user in some way, shape, or form. Everybody's a consumptive user. And so maybe the better way to frame it is, are they a contributing user? Like, what are they contributing to wildlife management for the future? So a contributing user versus a non-contributing user. And if you start thinking about it in those lines, and you also start thinking that that maybe the $100 should be going to paying for the management of the hunted species. Like, if I pay $50 for a deer tag, I'd love to know that $50 is going back into mule deer management, right? Yeah, I care about black-footed ferrets, and I care about western meadowlarks, and I care about all these other species, but I'd love to see my $100 go back into hunter conservation. The beauty about this Oregon bill is it's supplementing those other species. Like, it's helping to pay for the management of those species that aren't hunted, that aren't fished, but that still need management, which kind of frees up the $100 to go into paying for the management of those species that we're hunting. And in that regard, from that standpoint, there's still an awful lot of power for the hunting community if the model is built that way.
Yeah,
to have a lot of influence. So that's the counterpoint to the counterpoint that I wanted to make.
So a couple points on that. And the first one is it's important because even if you look at game animals, you want to know what pays their own way. You know this, Dave, but we think about some of the animals that were really, everybody's interested in hunting a bighorn sheep, right? Everyone wants their sheep tag, right?
But there aren't a lot of sheep tags.
That doesn't pay for itself.
Yeah.
It costs $2.2 million annually to manage bighorn sheep in the state of Wyoming. They don't get enough money from tags, from license sales. They just don't get the money to be able to run that program. And so that's actually the way it is for the majority of programs, especially the cool ones, the tags that everybody wants. You don't make enough off moose. You don't make enough off bighorn sheep. You don't make enough off mountain goats to be able to pay for the management of those species. So where's the money coming from? Well, the management of those species, the money is coming from deer. It's coming from elk. It's coming from small game licenses. It's coming from these other things. And then when you're doing that, right, you've only the pot of money is only so big. And if you really like elk habitat, just realize that you're giving up elk habitat money for this other stuff. Well, what if you had a different pot of money? What if you had more money to be able to pay for the management of these other species? Would it help your elk habitat? Yeah, it would. And it doesn't matter whether you're getting it from another, from a license, or if you're getting it from a third party. And you mentioned the non-contributing user. So who are the non-contributing user groups? Well, they're the mountain bikers, right? They are the hikers. They are the bird watchers. They're folks who just assume that if you don't do anything, that wildlife's just going to be there, that habitat's just going to be there. And it's just not the case. Without some investment in that habitat, then you're left, you're left to like whatever Mother Nature decides you're going to get.
Yeah,
which isn't always.
Remember, there's studies out there. Like, we're not pulling this out of the ether. There are studies out there that talk about the impact, like how elk and mule deer, for example, respond to human activity, as in mountain bikers on trails or hikers on trails, or ORV use versus Toyota, Tundra or Ford F-150 use on a track. Like, there's studies that talk about the impact that those activities, backcountry skiing, like, they have real displacement impact on wildlife.
One that's close to a lot of hunters' hearts. How about shed hunting?
Oh yeah, great one.
These are things that, like, they push animals around at vulnerable times of year when they're weak, when they, when you're having an effect. And anytime you're putting an animal at a caloric deficit, anytime you're making an animal work harder than it would have had to otherwise work, you're affecting the viability of the animal, and you're affecting the animal's reproductive capability. You're affecting its ability to get away from a predator when a predator shows up. And so these are all impacts. And, anytime you build a housing development in prime habitat. These are all impacts. These are things that are affecting wildlife. And so it makes sense to have other sources of funding. But it is important that hunters recognize that where our reluctance comes from, that other people recognize that. One of the other fears that I mean, this is a real fear. This isn't like I think this isn't an imaginary one, is with the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. There's been a push nationally from some individuals to remove Pittman-Robertson and to eliminate the Pittman and Robertson contribution. So the Pittman and Robertson tax, that 11% tax and 10% tax, depending on what you're talking about in terms of firearms, ammunition, fishing components, things like that, to get rid of that. And the idea is that, it's, because it's, contrary to the Second Amendment is what folks would say. I don't think that that's true. Frankly, I think that that's not a valid argument, but there are people that are making it on the national level. And so the concern is, one of the things that's kept that from happening is people who are Second Amendment advocates who are also hunting advocates saying, no, we need that. We need to be funding our game and fish agencies. We need to be funding habitat. And then the proponents of eliminating the PR tax are saying, well, what if we find you money someplace else? We'll just replace it. And so the concern is, again, it's just something we need to be aware of, is that there is that argument out there of somebody saying, like, let's take money from someplace else and then we'll eliminate 50%, $1 billion, $1.3 billion this year. That's what Pittman-Robertson and Dingell Johnson accounted for this year's $1.3 billion into conservation. So it's important. What are the other ways that states are making this up? So of course, Oregon, we've got the lodging tax that is, awaiting to see if it's going to move forward, the 1.25%. Other states do things like, there are states that give game and fish agencies money out of a general appropriation.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll cut some money aside and provide that. There are states that have secondary taxes, just like the lodging tax. There are states that have taxes on other stuff, recreation taxes.
Like Montana weed for wildlife. They've got a marijuana. No, serious. They got a marijuana tax that goes to helping fund their wildlife agency, right?
During the Reagan administration, one of our first episodes, we talked about this, the backpack tax. So there was a proposed national tax by the Reagan administration on other outdoor gear, things like tents and backpacks and hiking boots. And the idea was that all the users could become contributing users by paying a portion of it. And of course, famously, OIA came into existence to fight the backpack tax. So when you see the primary entity that, speaks on behalf of the outdoor industry right now, they were developed and they continue to oppose a specific tax that goes to habitat, that goes to wildlife. And that's, that's curious.
Draw your own conclusions.
Yeah, decide whatever you want, but you guys should start paying your way, OIA. And then, there's a discussion, there's discussion in every state. And of course, Dave, you know that I am a big fan of the lottery. And so
yes, I do. The Colorado model.
Yeah, the Colorado model. And of course, if you were in a state, I don't know, that didn't have, for example, scratch ticket lottery.
We're not going down this. We're not going down this road right now.
Scratch ticket lottery for wildlife, Dave.
We're not going down that path right now.
I just think it's an idea that has merit to talk about.
It's an idea, right?
Yeah.
Gambling for, what do you call it? Gambling for grouse? I don't know. It's got to have some alliteration to it.
I like it. I'm in.
Lottery for loons. We don't hunt loons. Anyway, there's also Missouri, Louisiana, I think is another one. Have Missouri for sure is sort of the famous. That's I don't know about that. That could be taken a different way. Anyway, I don't know that you want to do that. Missouri's got this model where they have a 0.9% sales tax that was constitutionally instituted to help pay for wildlife management in that state. And
the governor there
highly successful for them.
Yeah, the governor there famously received the Coleman Award right, Dave? The Golden Lantern, the Coleman Golden
yeah.
Lantern for his work on outdoor recreation. Received it as well as Matt Mead, Governor of Wyoming, received the same award, I believe, the same year. Yeah.
That's right.
Bipartisan leaders in conservation and outdoor rec.
Yeah, so there are license plate checkoffs, and there are, I can't even, I'm trying to think of all the different things. There are a lot of different models out there to help generate additional revenue. But I will say the ones that have been most successful in generating really substantial amounts of revenue have been like the Colorado model with the lottery tax, or I don't know if it's lottery tax, lottery revenues, certain percentage of those go into the agency. This sales tax, constitutional sales tax in Missouri. And I suspect this one in Oregon you're going to look back and say, that's pretty significant. And the beauty about a lodging tax, I mean, this is a thing that I don't know if you and I have talked about it, but in our circles, we've talked about it a lot. Kind of the beauty about a lodging tax is, for the most part, it's a tourist tax. Like, it's mostly going to be paid by folks that are visiting the state from someplace else. And if you have an outdoor recreation economy state where outdoor recreation or tourism is one of your biggest industries, like in our state, for example, it's the second biggest industry, right? I don't know where it is in Oregon, but a lot of Western states, tourism, outdoor rec are growing, big time growing parts of the economy. And that can be a pretty significant shot in the arm that is then paid for by those that are coming to the state to see that wildlife. Like, that's what they want to see. And so if you're worried about, back to your initial point, this is just another counterpoint that I guess I'm sort of thinking of on the spot. But if there's this fear about who's going to have the seat at the table, chances are, if it's like this Oregon model where it's largely going to be paid by non-residents, you're not going to have a lot of non-residents that are now sitting on the commission with a seat at the table making these wildlife management decisions. It might be a pretty good model.
No, but it's important, there are more and more states that are looking at their commissions and how to make sure that those commissions have the best interests of wildlife and hunters and sportsmen, that they're considering that stuff, which kind of nicely segues into, look at a state like Colorado.
I was going to say the same thing.
In Colorado, you've had some significant changes in the commission where you had some people that resigned recently and new seats filled, and Colorado just took an action where the commission just moved to ban trapping, to ban the sale of
they didn't ban trapping.
The commercial use of furs, like the commercial use of animal products.
Like, basically, it's
what do you want to say, Dave?
Yeah, I mean, it's the commission received a petition from the public, right? That asked so it was a citizen petition to ban the commercial sale of fur. So it was going to prohibit the proposal would prohibit the sale, barter, or trade of wildlife furs and fur bearer parts statewide. So it doesn't ban trapping, but you could make the argument that it's a backdoor way to banning trapping, to effectively, in some ways, eliminating trapping. Because a lot of trapping is done for commercial purposes, right?
Yeah, and in that way, it's different than hunting. So when we look at hunting, everybody knows that you can't sell game meat, right? There's not a question about that. Trapping's different. Trapping has always been, I don't know. I don't know whether I would say it. It's much more common. It's common for it to be commercial in nature, right? If people are trapping, they're harvesting an animal via trapping, and then what are they doing with that? In many cases, they're utilizing the pelts from that, or the products from that, for some commercial purpose. You can't do that with hunting and meat. You certainly can with trapping. In fact, that's part of the paradigm.
Yeah, and I mean, I've heard people make this argument that being able to sell, fur, for example, is counter to the North American model. of wildlife management, of that wildlife shouldn't be used for commercial purposes, right? That's sort of one of the, I don't have the tenets right in front of me, but I believe that's one of them, or close to it, something like that. And so it creates a tricky, like a kind of a sticky spot. But remember, the North American model is that I'm gonna take some heat for saying it this way. North American model is a theory of management put on paper by academics.
That's right.
In the early 2000s. It's not a law anywhere. It's an analysis of how wildlife has been managed over in modern times since the turn of the 20th century, and identifies what the main principles of that management structure are, right?
Yeah, tenets that allow it to work. But it'd be a mistake for anybody to think that in the 1930s or 1800s or something, we came up with this idea like, we're going to develop the North American model, and it's going to have A, B, C, D, and E. That's what makes it work. That's just not the case. The reality of how the North American model, we call it the North American model, but it's something that we've built over 100 years. It's something that's changed slightly. There's been nuance. There's been some differences to it. There have been things that we've worked on, and I think it's interesting. And I don't know, Dave, like the idea again. I think we all know that you can't have a commercial market for wild game meat. Okay, so let's just say that right up front. There's no doubt about it. You're going to get prosecuted if you're shooting elk and then you're selling elk at your restaurant that you shot. Dead, right, or that your neighbor shot, you bought from him, you're going to get prosecuted. That's the reality. If you bought a set of antlers from somebody.
Yeah. Also, what about a shoulder mount?
It's not the same thing.
You can sell those. Right?
And that's the issue. We've got people now with this, they're saying that it is the same. It's not. We've come to these specific moratoriums on things for a reason. And so when you look at the North American model, you have to realize that there wasn't like a hard and fast rule. It's not like the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not steal. And then suddenly you're like everything bases around that. No, you come to the specific regulation based on a need for a management objective and a management goal. You need to look at what was the actual goal of the North, whatever we want to call it. What was the management objective that Game and Fish set out to do? Well, they wanted to keep people from killing animals, just shooting a ton of deer and then selling the meat at market. And so what did they do? They banned that.
Right. And you also had, at the same time, you had things like passenger pigeons, right, that were killed by the millions and ultimately to extinction in the early 1900s, and largely killed for market, to take into market for sale, for commercial sale.
The specific management restriction is prescriptive to stop a harm. It's prescriptive for a given use, for a given problem. And we can't lose sight of that within game and fish agencies or within the user community. When we pass laws outlawing the law of something, I don't care what it is. I don't like this is it, we're doing that for a reason. You don't just have a blanket where you say like, we're banning this concept of everything forever. No. What's the reason? What are we trying to protect? What are we trying to do? What is our statutory charge? How do we get there? Our statutory charge for conservation of the species required that we do this thing. And so we passed that law. We make those changes. We pass national laws. We pass state laws to fix these things. We are not beholden to where they were. And this is important because we're going to have new things come up. We're going to see new technologies. We're going to see stuff that is going to show up and we're going to say like, how does that fit into the management paradigm? We have to look at those things and we have to regulate them appropriately accordingly when they show up. Why does this have anything to do with trapping? Because frankly, we need trapping as a management tool. Trapping is a tool that we need on the ground for management. And people selling furs so that you can have a beaver hat from Stetson, right? That does not represent an area of concern for conservation of any species. We have the management in place. the paradigm works, allowing trappers to commercially utilize fur or people to sell parts of, pheasant feathers for fly fishing. None of these things represent a conservation concern. They don't, like, we're on top of it. The commissions are on top of it.
Let me take it one step farther.
Go ahead.
Yeah, which is the wildlife management should be science-based. I mean, you want to talk about, that's not just a tenet or the North American model, but that's actually built into most statutes in most states, science-based management. And so there are existing authorities under every state's law already where if a certain activity is causing, and if it's trapping and that trapping is causing muskrat populations or beaver populations, or pick the trapped species populations to decline significantly, then there's a mechanism built in under the science-based management model within the statute for the agency and the commission to correct that on their own and to say the data, the science doesn't support continuing this practice. So they already have that tool to do it. So instead of a science-based management decision, what we're looking at here is an emotionally based management decision through a citizen petition that just says, we don't like this practice, so we don't think you should do it anymore. And that can be harmful to wildlife management. So that's I guess the precise way I'd describe that.
It is harmful because you're stepping away from, again, the perception versus the reality. You're looking at a little tiny piece of the picture, and I get it. When you look at when you look at Dave the otter and Frank the beaver, whatever, right? Like, that's what people are thinking about, and that's what the advocates of the ban are thinking about. Is they're thinking about, well, what about this specific? And they're not looking at the whole picture. They're not looking at what is a population of wildlife is a renewable resource, and it's a resource that has to be managed as such. Well, what happens if let's just say in the state of Colorado, let's just say you make it so there's no commercial viable use for trapping, right? Well, then if you're an agency that has depended on trapping to control anything, whatever it might be, you now have two choices. You're neither going to have to hope that people do it for free, right?
Yeah.
That what's the motivation now of the trapper to help you do your management job?
Yeah.
Because that's the reality. When you look at hunters and trappers, they are helping agencies manage wildlife populations. What do they get from it? Well, if you're a hunter, what do you get from it? Well, you get a freezer full of awesome food, great protein. You get the experiences, right? Let's just pretend we take that away. Or trappers, let's pretend we take away their motivation, which is, they, sell a beaver pelt to somebody. Well, now the agencies, now you're going to pay for it. Now taxpayers will pay for it.
Going back to that first point about who's paying for wildlife management and the strains on the system. Yep.
You'll pay for it when you go to the grocery store, or you'll pay for it in your property taxes. You'll pay for it because the agency still has to manage the population at the level that they were. Or how are they managing it before? Yeah, they manage the numbers of hunters and trappers in the field.
Yeah. I would say, or the other thing is that your money that you were paying for that deer license now has to go to pay for trapping in certain places, controlling places where you have because some conflict issues.
And that's exactly the issue. Is you used to have this factor again. People getting wrapped around the axle about I listened to some of the discussion from the people on that commission in Colorado, and they were discussing they had looked at the North American model and this isn't like that. And the issue is they're looking at it through a straw, right? They're looking at a circle. They're looking at it through a toilet paper tube, trying to, looking at the world through that viewpoint and failing to recognize that there are different motivations, and it's okay for there to be different motivations. And then the mechanism is different for the management piece and the control that you had to have there. And if you can't treat all these things exactly the same because they're not the same. I'm really disappointed in the commission's decision. I think
I'm too.
I think it's a big mistake, and I think it's a bad precedent. And here's the other thing that's funny, Dave. You know, of course, that this was on, you know, they snuck this in backdoor, right? They went to the commission with this petition because last year,
because they keep losing. They lost at the ballot. Yeah, that's
exactly right.
Yeah.
Now this has happened in other states before, and it frustrates me to no end. Where this has happened in the state of Wyoming. You had people who they failed to convince the public, they failed to convince the legislature, they failed to convince a broader group. But if you get enough squeaky wheels at the commission meeting, they convince the commissioners.
But sometimes it goes both ways.
Yeah, you and I, that this is, I hate this because the commission should be making these decisions based on science, right?
Right.
Not based on politics. And if they fail to do that, then you're opening the door for what you absolutely hate. And you know that I am on this, which is of somebody saying, you know what I want to do? I want to be able to control who's on that commission. I want to be able, if they cannot be trusted to be scientific and honest and above the fray, then you got to then game on. We should be able to get them changed. And so, that's, and that's the problem is in a perfect world, our commissions would not be, somebody comes in with a different political persuasion, changes 3 members of the commission, and then pushes something through the commission that the general populace wouldn't support at the, either through the legislature or at the ballot. And, this is politicization of the Colorado Department of Parks and Wildlife Commission.
Oh, for sure. And if they were not successful here, the next thing they do though. So they're going to the commission here after losing that mountain lion fight, but they'll go to, they started with the commission with the mountain lion fight too, and lost there, and then went to the legislature and lost there, and then went and did a ballot initiative.
Lost there.
Watch out, because that could be the next path here. Except it seems like the commission's in a spot where they're going to say, "Now we're just going to let this happen. You're not going to have to go to the legislature. You're not going to have to do a ballot initiative and take it before the public. We're going to do it right here, and we're going to ignore our statutory charge of science-based management." But I will say it's not over yet. Okay, so this vote was 6-4 to move forward with the recommendation and to move forward with rulemaking. There still has to be rules drafted and formal rules adopted by the commission, and I believe the next opportunity then it'll go back before the commission in May. So there'll be more opportunity for public comment. There'll be more opportunity to try and see if try and convince the commission to change course on this. It's not a done deal yet.
Let's talk about why I hate rulemaking. So for those that don't know, here's what rulemaking is. And Colorado is big on this. Colorado opens up a lot of discretion for agencies to do things that lawmakers don't want to be responsible for having made the decision on. And so what is rulemaking? Rulemaking means that rather than take it before the legislature and pass a bill or requirement or restriction within a group of elected officials, instead you pass something that's very broad, and then you hand it to an agency. And you go to the state agency, you give them quote unquote rulemaking authority. And then what do? They're going to decide the nuts and bolts of it. And so you've taken that, there's really good and bad about that. The bad is, you're not going to talk about it in the same way in a public forum. The good is, at least then you have people who are typically professionals in that space who are developing the rules, laws, regulation in that space. But you'll look at some states where, the level of rulemaking, the types of fines, all those things, they can give state agencies a whole lot of power to make decisions that you would never get across the desks of legislators, across the governor's desk with a signature on it, because it would be too politically unpopular. And so, it's headed for rulemaking. And how do you play in the rulemaking process? You have to show up to those meetings. You have to have those discussions. And for good or bad, here's what happens in the rulemaking process. Typically, people who are more expert in the area are going to have a lot more leverage in rulemaking. So if you are a wildlife professional, if you are a trapper, if you belong to one of those organizations, if you are willing to put in the work your voice becomes much louder in the rulemaking process than it was in, say, a ballot initiative. Why? Because there just aren't going to be as many people weighing in the room. When there's only 100 people in the room instead of 1,000, your voice carries more weight. That's good and bad. It's good because your voice can carry more weight. It's bad because the exact same thing happens for the people that think the exact opposite of you. It takes less of them to make their voice heard in that instance as well. So it's really incumbent upon you to show up.
Yep. Being there in person to public meetings, submit public comments, talk to NGOs that might be going in, get your thoughts in through them too, because they'll be, hunting organizations and so forth that come in and weigh in as well. Lots of ways to weigh in, but you can't go silent on it, right? Silence is death on the rulemaking process. The surest way to not get any changes made is to just throw your hand up and say, I'm not going to comment, not going to participate.
Yeah. And not just any changes made. The surest way to make sure that somebody else's ideas are there. And that's
right.
And you'll find that with every game and fish agency. So there you go. That's probably enough on the Colorado Commission.
Yeah. So we've gone Oregon, we've gone to Colorado. Do you want to bounce over to Idaho for a couple minutes?
Might as well. What's more fun than Idaho?
I don't know. There's fun stuff in Idaho. There's fun stuff in Wyoming. There's fun stuff. There's just lots of stuff going on because state legislatures are in really all over the place right now. So there's just a lot of stuff going on right now in a lot of
Idaho
states.
Has had some interesting stuff going on in Idaho. So of course, Idaho is a state that has a lot of, Western big game issues. There's some predatory issues because of course it's in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, at least a little corner of it. And so one of the things that Idaho has been earnestly working on is they have a great technology working group where their game and fish agency sits down with a bunch of different stakeholders and talks about, tech in hunting space. And I will say some of the stuff they come up with, I think, is nuts. And some of it's really good. So congratulations, Idaho, on being either A, crazy, or B, very smart, or both things at the same time. But they have a great governor's office. They have a great commission. They have great staff there. But they were working on a technology bill that had some discussions about technology. And my guess is they're going to have to work on it again.
Yeah, that's what it's seeming like, that they're going to have to work on it again. Some of the technology, I might get, it included a lot of stuff, and I don't have it pulled up, but it was looking to restrict the use of certain technologies during hunting season. Things like cellular trail cams, things like thermal and night vision technologies. I'm probably missing a couple, but those types of technologies that, if you're hunting elk or deer, pronghorn, there's this, if you adhere to fair chase principles, there's an argument to be made that some of those, technologies give you a significant advantage and kind of cut against the fair chase ethic that hunters are taught to adhere to.
So the Idaho bill was transmitting trail cameras, thermal and night vision, drones, certain scopes, and then traditional cameras is the notes that I have. And so some of them may be wrong. So Keely, when you read this, you can tell me how I was wrong. But hey, but yeah, I think this is a topic that's hot in a bunch of states. It's not just Idaho. I got a call from a reporter with CBS last year asking me about the controversy associated with the use of thermal and night vision and big game hunting. And he wanted to talk about the conflict and controversy within the hunting community. And I stopped him immediately. I said, look, that's not the case. There's not conflict. And I maintain that. There's not conflict. When it comes to big game hunting, big game animals, there's not conflict. There's consensus.
And when you talk big game, we're talking
about elk, deer.
Think of big ungulates, right? Like elk, deer, pronghorn, mule deer, whitetail deer,
the desirable
sheep, mountain goats, moose, like those. That's what you're talking about.
Yeah, there's consensus. You're not going to find big game hunters with there will be notable exceptions, and it's going to be somebody that doesn't, they're I mean, I can go on to why they have the exceptions, but it's just not the case. The consensus is this. There's not a place for thermal in hunting elk. There's just not, And so why is that? Well, I've tried I've tried to, wrap my head around this and explain it in a way that he could understand so that people could understand. But, frankly, you had to help him understand, first of all, that there's a difference between big game hunting for something like a trophy elk and controlling feral animals. And so, non-native species, because we call them the same thing, right? If somebody goes out and they are, trying to eliminate feral hogs in Texas, what do they call it? Hog hunting, right?
Mm-hmm.
We don't call it something different. We don't differentiate it. But anybody who's a hunter knows that it's a different thing. Going out in the middle of the night to eliminate an animal that kills baby deer and eats, nesting birds
and
eggs
just
and all
ravages landscapes and habitat of other things,
destroys stuff, and is not a native, that is reproducing, and there's more of them on accident, not on purpose. We are not, when we talk about Pittman Robertson, what we're spending our money to provide habitat and opportunity for, it's not feral hogs.
It's for the stuff that's always been here, right? The native stuff that's been here for thousands of years that we want to see here for thousands more.
And one of the best tools that we can use. So I actually had this discussion with a really close personal friend who works for a federal agency that controls feral hogs in a bunch of states. And we were having this discussion about what makes the federal guys more effective. So if you take a federal wildlife control specialist out and you allow them to depopulate hogs in an area, what tools do you think they're using?
Well, I mean, I presume tannerite, just lots and lots of tannerite.
Yeah, but tannerite. But they're using a lot of thermal.
I would assume a lot of thermal.
Trapping. Yep, but the most effective tools, they're using the most effective tools. And so there was this discussion. They said, well, private individuals, they're not that effective at it. It's like, that's not true. If you give them the same tools, the public hunter is effective at controlling the same things. And that is the case when you give them the same tools. Those tools don't have a place in the big game woods. Why? And this is where I've come, I've come to start to talk about, and I'll be on a panel at the North American Dave with Boone and Crockett and some other folks talking about this, about technology.
I hope I can watch that panel. I've got a bunch of stuff. I'm doing a couple of special sessions and panels myself. So hopefully it don't overlap, because everybody's going to want to come watch my panel. And, I want you to have an audience.
Yeah, sure. What's yours going to be on? So anyway, the concern is this, and this is where the fishing community, we're going to have some interesting discussions with. There's no place for elk radar. We shouldn't have that thing. So when we're talking about technologies for big game hunting and fair chase, if you couldn't find the elk before with the tools that you had when you popped out of the womb, then you shouldn't be able to buy a new tool that helps you find it.
Except for binoculars.
Yeah, that's an interesting discussion. And we're not going to pass by, where that ship has sailed, right?
Yeah, I know.
But you're just augmenting, but that's still your visible spectrum. That's what you can naturally see. You didn't now suddenly, and animals know that you can naturally see that because it's their natural eyesight. It's your natural eyesight. You didn't give yourself, some magical ability to see, you did not give yourself elk radar by buying a set of binoculars.
Well, no. And I think about this with the thermal piece. I've thought about this we've talked about this, you and I, just offline before, but I thought about my own elk hunting experience this year. And remember how I told you when I was successful, I got this elk, but I saw one cow grazing in pine regeneration, post-fire regen. one cow. And I spent half an hour or so getting myself right, getting the wind right, putting on a sneak. And I'm like, it was my last day of the hunt. I'm like, I'm going to shoot this cow. And I saw her, I would peek up and see her repeatedly. She was still grazing in the direction I was moving. And I was trying to get myself positioned to cut her off as she was working up this hill. And even when I got into position and I got myself a good rest, and I'm like, I'm going to shoot this cow. And I didn't see any other elk. And then all of a sudden, this bull comes charging out from below her and chases her off. And then I hit the cow call and he freezes. And I'm like, well, I guess I'm going to shoot him instead. And so I shot this bull. And then I shot that bull. And it turns out one elk became two and two became about 30. And if I'd had thermals, I would have probably known before I put the sneak on just how many elk were there.
Yeah.
And I don't know that that's right. I had an awesome experience of just the woods opening up on me that I wouldn't have had otherwise also, but also it just would have felt really, really unfair.
Yeah. We shouldn't have, we shouldn't be using technology to give ourselves an ability that we don't naturally have. And that's across the board. If you look at that, look at transmitting trail cameras, right? If we're going to use AI, right? We're in a new world of technology. If we're going to have little robot Daves and little robot Nephis that are out there and little robots doing the work for us so that we don't have to be there anymore, that's it. That's what we're talking about. That doesn't have a place in the big game field. If we're going to give ourselves eyesight that we didn't, we don't naturally have, if we're like, wouldn't it be cool if we got we had a scent detector, right? These are, drones, right? We're giving ourselves the ability. Now we're flying. Now we're flying and we have eyesight too. These are things that, they don't have a place, and that's okay. Is there a place for those tools? You bet. There's a place for those tools. What's the place for those tools? Well, transmitting trail cameras is an awesome way to see wildlife, to manage wildlife, to see where stuff's going, to figure out where you're going to do habitat improvements, it's a great way to track a lot of stuff, but it doesn't have a place there. Thermal and night vision, absolutely a tool that should be on the table. What should it be on the table for? It should absolutely be on the table for predators, and which is one of the issues that they had in Idaho, right? Is because when they included in the use of areas where you couldn't use this stuff, they included wolves, which, while a trophy animal in Idaho, kind of a predator. And so, but there's a place for that. There's also a place, I would argue for thermal, there's a great place for thermal after you take a big game animal. So let's say you pull the trigger.
Oh, to find it?
And now you've got a dead animal someplace and you need to find it. Absolutely phenomenal place for thermal. The problem is you need to make sure that people aren't using it inappropriately first, not using, elk radar to find a live elk, that they should be, when they should just be using their binoculars. So this is a challenging area. It's going to be an area that we need to stay on top of, that we have to talk about, but we need to acknowledge that there are appropriate uses for these technologies, and there's places where we shouldn't have them. And we need to be able to identify the difference. One of the things that I like, I'm going to talk about on this panel, is active versus passive. As we move into technology and we move into these areas, what are the things that we're asking machines to do for us that we couldn't naturally do? I call that active. And that's where that's when we don't need it. So whether it's finding the stuff for you, whether it's pulling the trigger for you, all those things are active uses of technology that I don't know they don't have a place in fair chase. That said, do they have a place in wildlife management? Yeah, they probably do. In different areas, right? There's situations when you're going to have depredation, where you're going to have control, where you're going to have, almost like we talked about trapping, where there are areas where our management decisions are going to lead us to say, like, hey, for this purpose, we need to have access to the more effective tool. That's okay. But that's a different world. And we need to make sure that we have, I think, a clear, bright line between those two worlds.
All right. We've talked Oregon. We've talked Colorado. We've talked Idaho, but we're also at the 1 hour mark. And I had a thought on the one we were going to talk about. And I don't think we should talk about it. I think we should find a guest. I think we should bring on the sponsor to talk about it.
That's a great idea. I like that.
Yeah. So I think maybe that's what we do, and hold off on one until next time and see if we can't track down the sponsor of this particular bill, see if they might be able to come on and talk a little bit about it themselves, why they want to do it, all that sort of thing. I think you know who I'm talking about, but I'm not going to say it out loud right now.
I know who it is.
Yeah, I know you do. Do you have anything else? I don't know that I got anything else.
No, I hope this works out good. You know, it felt a little bit clunky, I think, because with the tech, I think for everybody, like, we're more entertaining than this. But
are we? I don't know that we.
This is our first go with the tech, and so I'm a little bit distracted. Maybe you are too. We're going to make sure that this all works. We're going to kick it out there for you. But it was good to see you, Dave. It was nice to talk about some issues, and talk again next week.
I love it. Let's do that. And as always, everybody remember that life is about experiences. So go have one.